I strongly recommend Atelier Sophie 2, The Alchemist of the Mysterious Dream. This might feel like a waste of work to open with that, rather than building up to it, but this game is just joyful and fun, in a way that will be such a palate cleanse for most gamers. So I think it's worth stating off the bat. Already, 2022 has done a lot for the gaming industry, but most of what I've played recently, from Dying Light 2 to Horizon Forbidden West and Elden Ring, have all been bleak and atmospheric. There's not a bad game of the three, but all the worlds above are dystopian catastrophes. That setting makes it easier to push adversity onto the player, to create obstacles and difficult encounters, both narratively and in gameplay, that ultimately seeks to give you a feeling of overcoming. While gaming is about the challenge, it's also about escapism, and that has been severely lacking. Enter Atelier Sophie 2, the sequel to 2015's Atelier Sophie, released on the 25th of February 2022 for PS4, PC and Nintendo Switch. For those who are unaware, this is a JRPG series that's been running since the late 90s and focuses on a gameplay loop of gathering and crafting items. This plays into the titular atelier, which features the workplace of an artisan or an inventor. For the most part, these are practitioners of alchemy and are anime witches with cauldrons and lovable sidekicks. Each one is equal part inventor, adventurer, and warrior princess. Perhaps the first point of note here is that while this is a direct sequel to Atelier Sophie, familiarity with the original game is not a necessity, and there are helpful recap videos if you do want to jump in here without having played the original. This game picks up a few months after the end of that game, but before the start of Atelier Firis, which is the next game in the mysterious saga. Before the first cutscene is over, Sophie and her BFF Placta are accidentally pulled into a magical vortex and land in an alternate world where people can freely seek to achieve their goals and dreams. This story requires players buy into the world and premise, which at times does feel like it's asking you to accept a lot of coincidence, but these characters are just so damn likeable, optimistic and fun to be with that you're going to want to accept this surreal premise. Sophie is just a good protagonist. She's the right amount of capable and naive, a careful mix of curious and chaotic, and a resolute blend of dutiful and free. She arrives in this world through the vortex and is separated from Placta. The early part of her journey sees her go in search of a friend, but along the way there are some surprises. There's another alchemist already in this world by the name of Placta, and there's a lingering overture that she may or may not be Sophie's Placta from the past. There's also a woman who shares the same name as Sophie's grandmother, who may or may not be the woman herself. This world of dreams takes little heed of space and time, but the story never felt like it took too many crazy leaps. In fact, it was kind of fun to watch the game just do what it wanted with the narrative, and not take itself too seriously. The craziest thing is that, somehow, it just works. If anything, these characters could be described as overdeveloped. This game drinks from the same fountain as Fire Emblem and Persona. One thing also worth noting is that you're going to be passing through large amounts of written text unless you speak Japanese, as there is no English audio track. I don't really see this as an issue, as I prefer the tone and mannerisms of the original track while being able to read the translation. I can't comment on the accuracy of this, but at no point did it feel like there was something missing, or information that hadn't been provided to me. Let's leave the story behind here, as I don't need to heap more praise upon it. Instead, I want to look at progression. Progression is a key theme in a lot of the games I play and review. It's normally the feature that I resonate the most with in games outside of their narrative, and a good one can overcome a lot, and a bad one can topple your product like a house of cards. Sophie's progression is tied into every aspect of gameplay, and the pacing is consistent without devaluing what you've already unlocked and achieved. The primary form of progression is unlocking new items and crafting recipes. These serve as tools, weapons, and consumable items to help both in the overworld and in combat. Recipes are unlocked through story progress, exploring the world and defeating monsters. They can also be acquired by crafting other recipes, which neatly loops into every major aspect of gameplay. Gameplay therefore falls into exploration, as Sophie goes around towns and field areas searching for new areas to explore and gathering materials. Combat, where Sophie and her friends defeat monsters in turn-based battles. And then crafting, where Sophie or Placta turn ingredients into items to use in either exploration or combat. As the game premise and title suggest, you are going to spend a lot of time at your cauldron concocting your witchy brews. All items in the Atelier games have a quality from E to S rank and a handful of natural effects, which are specific to that item, and then random traits. To start with, you'll mostly be crafting low quality items with a passing grade of natural effect. Once you get better materials, you can craft the same item again, but this time with its full effect. Towards the end of the game, you can use some powerful traits as well, to give the original item extra buffs and bonuses, either via flat-out performance boosts or by triggering additional effects. This multi-tiered system makes the game very accessible for all, as depending on how much time you want to invest into thinking about making the best items, you can choose your own difficulty and challenge. Story and normal difficulties are quite forgiving, and are for those who just want to experience the story and progress in a straight line. Hard provides more monetary reward for battling in return for a steeper challenge, and is the recommended difficulty for Atelier veterans. Very hard, charisma, and legendary difficulties are for those who want to create perfect items with maxed out quality, effects, and traits before they even want to get out of their starting area. Because all these systems are constantly working on every item you loot and craft, the crafting gameplay can end up being a bit intricate. Early game synthesis might be quite accessible and beginner friendly, but the late game synthesis is very complicated, and if you're coming into this from the Riser games, or if this is your first Atelier title, there's another level you'll have to climb on the learning curve. This system has much more depth and intricacy at the late game than it does at the early game, with catalysts and managing traits to concern yourself with. Worry not if you're an Atelier newbie, as there is a do it for me button if you're here for another aspect of the gameplay, but as a result, you won't be making bombs that can one-shot bosses. Combat's next, and this is where most of your new toys you've crafted will function. This is a turn-based system, similar to that used in the other Mysterious Saga games, that being Sophie, Firis, and Lydia and Suelle. The more recent games, like Riser and Riser 2, use what I would call an on-rails auto-battle system that I'm going to put on screen here. This felt much more like a mobile game design, as it tended to weigh heavily on the simple fact that you are stronger than this enemy, rather than any tactical nuance being involved. As has become common with JRPGs that use turn-based systems, there's a hook. This is the support system, where you can expend a gauge to allow your front and backline party members to both attack and then switch in and out. This can create powerful openings to complement regular skills and attacks. As the game is primarily about crafting, you can also use your synthesized consumables to assist. Depending on how good you are at mixing effects and traits, you can make some insanely powerful bombs that make even the game's toughest monsters simple to beat, or a healing potion that makes you borderline invincible. Some of the stronger enemies do now have elemental resistant auras that must be broken before you can do the maximum damage to them. This is what I can only assume to be the series' attempts to reduce the number of encounters you can one-shot with powerful attack items. The final gameplay aspect, exploration and gathering, has received the most attention since the original Sophie game, which is 7 years old at this point. This now includes gathering tools as in Riser, which can be augmented with stronger effects to increase their potency, with a new slingshot to help gather from high places thrown in for good measure. New for Sophie 2 is a little minigame for some of the larger gathering nodes, which is a minor but not unwelcome addition to the game to help break up the usual process of hoarding materials. What's missing here is the mount that we got in Riser 2, and in its place are new items that let you control the weather. This mechanic is used in the more literal sense for progression, as a river will be blocking your path, so changing the weather to snow will freeze it over and let you walk across. Weather changing also influences the environment in a way that alters what you can gather, where you can go, and some enemy spawns, as well as providing a field advantage to either Sophie or the enemy in a handful of boss battles. Combining this with the gathering system changes present tangible improvements across the board for all gameplay relevant aspects. The other aspects of the game still feel as old as they did in 2015. This starts with the playable area. These levels have always felt like PS3 era design decisions, being little more than linear corridors with some twists and turns. That feeling does exist here too, with every zone being instanced and a clear route from point A to point B always available. The game also suffers greatly from invisible walls and objects that you know you should be able to jump over, but it won't let you. Another part of the game that is lacking is animations. Every action, be that jumping, running, or collecting, feels stiff and rigid. These are certainly weak elements of the game that hold it back from feeling like a PS4 era title. And yes, I do specifically mean the PS4 era. This game is in no way shape ready to be a PS5 title. Graphically, this is certainly better than the original Sophie though. The textures we got are smoother and less pixelated. Everything feels much more like we got in the Riser games, and I do mean that in a good way. Object detail is a weakness, but the anime art style does help put to bed a lot of graphical concerns where it comes to character models, while level and environmental design don't benefit quite as much. Some elements here feel similarly PS3-esque, like the walls and rocky edges. Enemy design is also starting to feel a little stagnant. All JRPGs palette swap and reskin their enemies at some point, but it's time the Atelier series injected some new ones. Aside from some later game monsters, you're mostly fighting plants, mushrooms, slimes, bats, and ghosts. These are just reskins as you progress, and there are very few random battles that feel unique. This franchise is really starting to feel its age in terms of enemy design, at a time when it's breaking new ground with gameplay and traversal mechanics. Okay, I think all that's left is to get to the absolute worst part of this game, and I just want to get this over and done with, so bear with me. Atelier Sophie 2 has legitimate issues with character design, but not their dialogue or personalities. Rather than models and visual presentation, I'm specifically referring to female characters other than Sophie, and it's not specific to the main party. I'm aware that a large portion of the community that play this type of game do so for reasons other than the gameplay or narrative. I do not fall into that category and cannot claim to fully understand that mindset. My objection is not to unique character traits, like Alette's crazy hair or Placta's fake ears and tail. Anime is gonna anime. Rather, it's the fact that half the cast here don't seem to be aware of the concept of a skirt, or trousers. If they don't fall into that category, then the game clearly draws your attention to their chest area. Some characters fall into both. I like the crafting and turn-based combat, and view this as a sanity tax on playing Atelier games. But if this is what you like, if this is what you're here for, it's here in spades. There's even a late-game hot spring scene, which might just be the most surreal story moment in a game that opened with a girl and a talking doll being sucked into a magical vortex and transported to the land of dreams. There's also the usual paid DLC if what you desperately want in life is to watch Sophie and co. run around dressed as maids. I honestly don't know if I'm more annoyed at the microtransactions themselves or the fact that there's clearly a market for them. If you can look past this and appreciate that someone put in the effort to making the other aspects of these characters, the design's actually excellent. Rami and Sophie's similarities are obvious, but they never feel like a copy and paste of each other. And Olias and Diebold look like era-appropriate heroic warriors. These characters have clearly had a lot of thought and effort put into their design, but, as always, I wonder just how much of the game's potential was sucked out and used to inflate the chests of some of these character models. I will admit a chunk of that potential was clearly used to increase the game's length. Compared to Atelier Ryza 2, this clocks in at an extra 15 hours of game time, taking me roughly 55 hours to clean up the story and another 5 to further complete all the missing bits for a perfect game. I don't know if a development studio can be self-aware, but that's certainly the closest word I can think of when justifying all the praise I have here for the writing in Atelier Sophie 2. It's difficult to make a game like this as upbeat and optimistic as this without it becoming a cloying mess, and Gus passed with flying colours. Every character does check a box, and they also have real backstories and development arcs. As much as they might appear to be 2D window dressing for an adventure about Sophie, the writing is never poor. The story asks you to buy into its premise, but it never takes it for granted. This is video game escapism at its best, and if you're willing to give it a chance, even the greatest cynic will be swept along by Sophie's optimism and hope. This is backed up by a strong gameplay loop that is accessible for all skills and abilities, and a gear system that has a genuine meta for people to chase, and enough interactable objects to keep your hoarder tendencies in check for the foreseeable future. As always, this type of game is let down by its graphics and engine limitations, and unless this is your type of game, you'll struggle to justify paying the full retail price for a copy. But keep this game in mind. There's something buoyant and wholesome about the Atelier series if you go into these games with a child's innocence, and something just a little off-centre if you don't. I like to think that most of the world can appreciate a happy-go-lucky young girl on an adventure for what it is, joyous escapism. As such, in a video game year where the dystopian apocalypse seems to be all the rage, I strongly recommend Atelier Sophie 2 as a palate cleanse.